Welcome back, brothers and sisters, to part 2 of our funeral workshop series. So this is part 2 of 3. The first part was dealing with theology topics and dealing with humanity, what it means to be human, what it means to be made in God's image and the sacredness that comes with it, as well as the resurrection of Jesus and our own resurrection from the dead, and what it means to be raised from the dead and to have Christian hope. And so those topics were part 1. Those of you who watched all the way to the end, you may have needed a break just to sort of think and contemplate about some of the conversation there that we had. And again, I'm welcome to have further discussion about some of those theological topics. We're now moving into part 2, which is all about funerals as an act of worship, as part of the Christian life, and to what makes a funeral good. And so we see that's going to be the fundamental question. What is a good funeral versus a bad funeral, or a Christian funeral versus a secular funeral? And so here's the general problem. Okay, the general problem is when a person dies, the body needs to be dealt with. Christian funeral practices emerge at the intersection of necessity, custom, and conviction. And so those three things, necessity, custom, and conviction, all play a role in the funeral ritual and the death ritual. And we all recognize the necessity problem, right? So that's the first thing we deal with. Is necessity refers to the fact that a death creates certain social needs and obligations. Living in a community with a dead body requires people to do something about it. And so here we have this fun quote. At one end of life, the community declares, "It's alive! It stinks! We'd better do something." At the other end, we echo, "It's dead! It stinks! We better do something." And so the necessity of tending to dead bodies belongs to the order of creation. Now, this phrase, order of creation, is important because it links us to the first article of the Creed. So God created the heavens and the earth. God created us mortal. He created us human. And so with that mortality, with that humanness, comes death. And the things that come with death, the obligations, are part of that theological category. And so our Christian vocations are guided by our theology, even in death. And so there is a Christian way of doing things when it comes to death. And that's sort of the point of this second part. So we have the necessity. We have to do something with this stinking, rotting corpse. We have to do something quickly. We can't sort of just put it to the side. And so we have to deal with it. Well, how is that sort of guided? Well, part of that is with custom. So our place in the world, geographically, historically, and culturally, both sets limits and offers possibilities for what actions are expected, for what seems fitting to do and not to do at the time of death. And so what does that mean? Well, geographically speaking. So for example, if you live in New York City, there are no more cemetery plots available to you. And so there are customs of moving the body, of dealing with it in a different way. You have to find a cemetery and take the body somewhere else, somewhere outside of the city, somewhere further away, because there's no space. In places below sea level, parts of Florida don't really have cemeteries. If you try, or New Orleans, you try and bury the dead in the ground, they'll float back up. And so what you do with the dead differs in that geographical location. Historically, what do you do with the dead? There are lots of different historical norms and historical practices. I mentioned in class that one of the functions. Going back a little bit. I was reading a book on Jewish names. The book wasn't just about Jewish names. The chapter was on Jewish names and the commonality of Jewish names and how many names have sort of appeared, and how do you find out what the names of people were in ancient times, because not everybody's literate, not everybody's writing books. How do you figure out names? Well, you go through burial records. Well, how do you go through burial records? Well, you go through these things called ossuary boxes. And what ossuary boxes are, they're bone boxes. And so in that historical time, what you would do is you would bury a body in a tomb for a year, let it decompose and rot away, and then a year after or so, you come back into the tomb, you unseal the tomb, you come back in, you take the bones off the slab, and you take the bones, you put them in a box, and then the box gets put somewhere else in sort of in in a sense, on a shelf. And so it's not taking up as much space as a body does. You compress it into a bone box, and you inscribe a name on it. This is Jim, son of Joseph, from Jerusalem, and you put the name on the box, and the box was on a shelf in the family tomb, and off you go. And then you're ready for the next person to die, and you put them on that. And so there's like 4 or 5 slabs in the front part of the tomb. And then that's where the bodies are placed, and then the body is decomposed and you move in. That's a historical custom, right? So we don't do that anymore. Instead, what we do in our historical time frame is we put somebody in a box and we bury them 6 feet down. That's typically what we find to be our custom. And there are cultural differences as well, and those cultural things come often from geography and history. Do you burn your bodies? Do you bury your bodies? Do you put them in an above ground tomb? Do you put them in a cave? Do you dress them nicely? Do you put them in a robe? All these sort of things are cultural sort of things, and those expectations sort of ground what's done and where you're doing them. And I used another example, a modern example of how this sort of plays itself out, and that was in my ministry in Kansas, in Southwest Kansas. Every funeral had a flower reading ceremony, and I said that to the people at the workshop, and I'm sure I'm saying it to you, and you're thinking, I've never been to a flower reading, why does that word keep escaping me? Ceremony. I've never been to a flower reading ceremony before. I don't know what you're talking about. Yet in Southwest Kansas, every funeral, whether it was held in Lakin or Ulysses or Garden City or wherever I did funerals in lots of different places. But there's always a card reading ceremony. And what does that look like? Well, the family gathers together at the church or the funeral home about an hour and a half before the visitation occurs for that day. They bring in the body. The casket is opened. The family is seated, and the funeral director reads the cards that came with the flowers. And so it's sort of like this set of flowers. He actually goes down the line. This arrangement is from your cousin Betty in Guyman, Oklahoma, and her card says, blessings on this day. I'm so sorry for your loss at, Jim. And then he goes, this flower is from Pioneer Electric Company, from the team that Jim worked with, and so they send their regards, and it's signed by the manager Steve. And then he goes, and these flowers are from the grandchildren, Mark, Susie, and Bill. And with love from your grandchildren, you were a wonderful grandfather. And just on down the line. And then the family gets up. They have a private viewing for 15-20 minutes. Then they leave. They go to the fellowship hall. The rest of the visitation kind of comes through, greets the family, and then actually usually the casket was wheeled back out for the viewing in sort of the narthex. And then the family was greeted, and there was sort of that visitation. And when the service began, the casket was brought back into the church, and then we had the service. And I talk about that's happening now. That's a cultural difference. That's a Lutheran thing to do. It's a Christian thing to do in Southwest Kansas, but we've never done it in Northwest Indiana or Central Indiana, or I haven't experienced it anywhere from Indiana. So why is that? Where does that come out of? Well, I think it's a geographical custom in which people couldn't travel because it's so far, it's such in the middle of nowhere that if your cousins or your family had left, or if you had left them and moved out there, it's a 6-hour, 7-hour, 8-hour drive. You can't fly in because the nearest airport is 3, 4, 5 hours away. And it's like, well, I'm just going to send them flowers. Well, if half the family only sends flowers, you don't know unless you read the flower cards who sort of recognize that Jim died. And so they read the cards to make sure that, okay, yeah, Aunt Susie over there in Guyman, it was 4-hour drive and she sent flowers instead. And so I recognize, she knows that this person has died. I know she can't be here. That's sort of thing what's happening. In northern Indiana, we were next to Chicago, Indianapolis Airport. People aren't necessarily as far apart. Families are still able to get together. You give people enough time, they'll fly in, they'll stop in, they'll come, and so you don't have to do sort of the flower readings. There isn't as much flowers given in absence kind of thing. So that's That's an example of that playing out in the modern world. So the second quote here is, looking at the early church in the Gentile world, they silently ignored what it found unworthy. It denounced what it found dangerous to the faith and welcomed what it could reinterpret in the light of the gospel. Cut off part of that quote there. And so that was just a recognition. That's what the church always does when it enters into a new mission field or a new situation. It examines what's going on around it. There's idol worshiping going on, but it's happening on a Sunday. So maybe we can incorporate some worship on a Sunday, right? So it's happening on this day. That's fine. We'll incorporate that. But they're sacrificing live animals. Well, we're gonna have to denounce that. We're gonna have to take that away. They wear these outfits, the colorful outfits on the day that they worship. We don't have to worry about that. We don't have to worry about it. We're not going to say anything about it. We're going to ignore it. It was associated with this thing, but if that's just their worship of it, it's just a worship, those sort of things. So the church has flexibility. It has the ability to, I remember one theologian puts it, spit out the bones. You can take in what's good and you can spit out the bones. That's sort of what this quote is getting after here. And so there are customs that we can there are parts of the culture that we can incorporate into a funeral service or into our worship that isn't bad. That's sort of neutral. That sort of fits into these categories of what's called adiaphora, things neither commanded nor forbidden. And so that's fine. There are things that are fine that we brought in. There are things that are sort of discouraged, and there are things that have to be preached against. And so there are things we say, no, that's not helpful, and there are things that say, no, that's heretical. And there's different responses and different ways to bring in the culture. Okay, so that's what that is dealing with. So those were the three things: necessity, custom. We haven't got to conviction yet. Conviction. So that sort of leads to this idea then that, and here there's a Latin phrase, and it is lex orandi, lex credendi. Lex orandi, lex credendi. It means the law of prayer and the law of creed, or the law of belief. In other words, what it means is one will always influence the other, that they are tied together. You cannot change a practice without it reflecting a new belief or a different belief. You can't change your belief and hold on to old practices. The two are always tied together. If they're not tied together, you can see the dissonance. You can see the disconnect between what they're practicing and what they're confessing and what they're believing. And so if they're not tied together, they soon will be. Okay, that's the other part. The people, they will only accept a dissonance between the two for so long before the two come back together again. So let's say, and I use this example, and I just want to be cautious with it because you might take it the wrong way. Someone comes up to me as a layperson, says to me, the pastor, "Look, Pastor, I think the best way to bring in new youth and new people is to bring in a praise band." Should I say yes or no to this suggestion? Well, I'm going to say no to this suggestion. Now, why am I saying no? Is it because I hate contemporary Christian music? Yes. Well, no. I do, but that's not the reason I'm saying no. I'm saying no because this person's theology is fundamentally flawed. They have confused the theology of mission and evangelism and worship all in one suggestion. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is they believe that by changing the way in which we worship, we will gather more people to ourselves as a church. We'll bring in more unbelievers and make them believers. In essence, what they're saying is that we'll baptize more people if we have a praise band. Now, tell me, where in Scripture does it link baptisms with praise bands? It does not. The work of the church is not to have a praise band. The work of the church is to preach and proclaim the gospel, right? So, would I say no to praise bands? Yes. Why? Because this person believes that praise bands and not the preaching of the gospel will bring people into faith. This is the same way with people who want to do some sort of activity because they believe that doing the activity will bring in new people and not the actual preaching of the gospel. This is my problem with... So, for example, LWML rummage sale. It's a great activity. It brings in a lot of funds, helps the community, does a lot of good things for the church and for the community. Everybody's sort of happy except the people who actually run it because they get exhausted and tired. Understandably so. No LWML person believes that by having the sale, they are sharing the gospel. They don't. It's a non-gospel church activity. And they recognize it as such. I recognize it as such. It's not a gospel-oriented activity of the church. Does it mean it's bad? No, because no one thinks it is. No one's saying we need to have the rummage sale that people can come to Jesus, so people can believe and hear the word preached. No, nobody thinks that. We need to have the rummage sale so that LWML has funds so they can sponsor things like a seminarian who's going to go out and preach the gospel, who's going to go out and be a missionary. That's why the LWML has a rummage sale, so that they can support the actions of those who will preach and proclaim the word. That it's a secondary cause to the preaching of the gospel, and it's recognized as such. Now, going back to our praise band example, if someone else says, Pastor, I've got two kids that one can play the guitar really well and one sings really well, and they've got a friend who's also in the youth group, and they play the drums, and they've got another friend who also sings. Can these four individuals play hymns or play some songs that they know in church and to give praise to God through their talents? Yeah, I'd be fine with that. Because this person sees what that is doing and what it accomplishes. That our worship is, and our praise is to share the voice and to share our talents with the Lord. It's a sacrifice of praise in that sort of sense. And so it's a right understanding of what's happening. And so again, so praise bands, sometimes praise bands is the example. You have praise bands and your liturgy is going to fall apart and you're not going to believe in Jesus anymore. And all of a sudden, you got women in the pulpit and the gays are running rampant, and all because you start with a praise band. No, that's not what's happening here. But little things like that do have connections. So, why do we have a pulpit? Why do we have a cross in front of the altar? Why do we have a crucifix? It's different than the Reformed churches. Why do we have stained glass windows? Why do we have only male pastors? Why do I wear an alb? All these sort of things convey a theological meaning, and if I don't actually believe in the things that they convey, there you'll find that dissonance. You'll find that it just doesn't sound right, or it'll slowly be transformed into something else. And so that's what lex orandi, lex credendi is saying. And our funerals, our funeral practice is saying something about our belief, and our beliefs are saying something to our funeral practices. And that's what lex orandi, lex credendi is getting after here, especially in this presentation, if I would stay focused on the topic at hand. So in the Christian funeral, the community of faith is invited once more and in dramatic fashion to recognize that the Christian life is shaped in the pattern of Christ's own life and death. That Christ and the Christian life is shaped by Christ's own life and death, that his life and death inform, and his resurrection inform us in our life, death, and resurrection. And so our theology should be shaping our funeral practices. That's all I'm kind of getting after here on this slide, and I kind of got off on the lex credendi, lex orandi sort of thing. And then I have this quote here because he uses this metaphor throughout, and I find it helpful, and we're going to see why in just a minute. But as we travel the last mile, we sing, we pray, we tell once again the gospel story, we say farewell, and in faith we return this, our friend, to God with thanksgiving. And so what he's seeing in his part of this conviction, so not only does he see this lex orandi, lex credendi, not only does he see that that there is such a thing as a Christian funeral that's shaped by our theology in Christ's death and resurrection, but he sees that what we as the church are to do in our Christian life is to travel that last mile, that last portion of the journey to God. The church picks up and carries the burden of the person to the Lord. And we sort of see this physically with the idea of pallbearers, right? There are six people who pick up and literally carry the body towards the grave, towards that last mile from the church to the cemetery. This body is carried and brought that last part of the journey. Okay, so now we sort of have this idea of this foundation of Christian funerals and being shaped by Christian theology. And now we're going to look a little bit at the culture's funeral. So I'm going to disappear for a moment so you can see the whole quote. If we ever needed evidence that writing good liturgy does not automatically generate good worship, the current state of the Christian funeral would be a prime case. While liturgical specialists quietly toiled away crafting funeral services of great beauty and depth, actual Christian funerals were often migrating toward vague celebrations of life, sometimes with such features as open mic speeches by friends and relatives, multimedia presentations of the life of the deceased, NASCAR logos on caskets, the deceased favorite pop music played from CDs, and cremated remains swirled into plastic sculptures. Yeah. So what he's referring to here is you have Vatican II, which in the Catholic Church sort of reshapes Catholic worship, and they begin writing new liturgies into the vernacular language, and so there are people tasked with that. You also have a plethora of new hymnals being published in the last several years. And so, for example, you may already recognize the LSB. Look, it matches my shirt, it like blends in. And so with the LSB, this came out in about 2005, 2006-ish, right around there, but had been being worked on for 5 or 6 years. And so, hymnals don't just fall out of the sky, but require lots of committees and meetings and working through and finding artists and writing liturgies and, adapting things and writing new tunes and all that. And so a lot of work was put in over the last 20, 30, 40 years into putting together good liturgies, liturgies for the church that are faithful and that are beautiful. And yet, while everyone was sort of working on these, the culture was sort of moving in an opposite direction and taking Christians along for the ride. And so what we find then is actual Christians sort of just following in with the culture, and we're finding these odd things that are not Christian happening at Christian funerals. And you're talking about that dissonance again. The way to get rid of dissonance is to remove the offending thing. And so you either have to remove the culture's practice or the Christian theology. And guess which one you get rid of? You get rid of the theology. And then you do what you want. And because, we are Americans and we are consumers, and the customer's always right and we'll get what we want, and that's just how it is. And who cares what the church says? Who cares what your pastor thinks? Who cares what is the true and proper Christian theology? So that's part of the problem. And yes, all of those things that are listed are real things. I have heard from people who have their deceased loved ones in a plastic sculpture. I have seen pop music played, and yes, I think I've even heard Highway to Hell at a funeral or a celebration of life or memorial service sort of thing. People are weird and they are stupid, and they do stupid and weird things. And the open mic thing is, it's terrible. But yeah. The multimedia presentations, we got to have pictures from birth to, confirmation to wedding to with the kids on Christmas, and you sort of see this whole slideshow and it's playing with music, and of course it's the pop music from CDs, and as technology improves, we just have these, picture memory slideshow things going on. So yeah, all of that's part of the American ritual these days. And sort of to emphasize that the new American way of death is personal, spiritual, and emotional. It is altruistic, futuristic, and individualistic. That's just a fun little quote there. And I emphasize the first three and the last one, personal, spiritual, emotional, individualistic. That isn't that, I mean, one, that's American culture in a nutshell, right? We're spiritual but not religious. We're certainly emotional driven. Everything is personal and made to cater to your individual tastes and thus individualistic. And we are future looking and altruistic. We want to be good people. And here is another quote. To put it bluntly, a society that has forgotten how to honor the bodies of those who have departed is more inclined to neglect, even torture, the bodies of those still living. A society that has no firm hope for where the dead are going is also unsure how to take the hands of its children and lead them toward a hopeful future. So, in other words, because we don't know what we believe, we don't know how to tell a good story to those who are still alive, and they are left searching for meaning in all the wrong places. That's, putting it bluntly. If your funeral doesn't tell a good story, then there is no story to be told, and people walk away hopeless and saddened, or feeling nothing. That also happens. People talking to people, asking at the workshop, how many of you gone to a funeral and you walked away from it thinking, I didn't get anything from any of that? And it's everybody has experienced a funeral like that. Everybody's gone to a funeral where no story was told, no one got any comfort, no one knew what was going on, but you shared some memories, saw some pictures, and said, sorry for your loss to the family members. And so, the American funeral is fundamentally, and above all else, disembodied. That's the root cause to the whole problem. Okay? We have neglected the body and our bodiliness to the point in which the American funeral doesn't even need a body and doesn't want it around. And so you get rid of the body, you get rid of all the ceremony with the body, you get rid of honoring the body, you make it disappear, and you deal instead with what? The spirit or the soul or the memory of the person, the real them, the true them. Is the spirit that dwells in our hearts and in heaven with grandma and grandpa and all those things. So, here is a contrast in poems. On the left, or your right, I don't know, whatever you're watching, I'm pretty sure it's on the left for you too. Over there, see how I don't quite know how a camera works with my screen? Over there, that side, the white side, is a poem that is often put on those little funeral cards, with their, on one side is the person's face and on the back side is a poem with, the front side's picture with dates, birth, death, marriage, those things are on front with a nice little oval faced, and there's Jim. And on the back there's a poem of some sort, and usually you find the white poem. And it says, "Do not stand at my grave and weep. I am not there, I do not sleep. I am in 1,000 winds that blow, I am the softly falling snow, I am the gentle showers of rain, I am the fields of ripening grain. I am in the morning hush, I am in the graceful rush of beautiful birds in circling flight, I am the starshine of the night. I am the flowers that bloom, I am in a quiet room, I am in the birds that sing, I am in each lovely thing. Do not stand at my grave and cry, I am not there, I do not die." That's terrible. It's terrible. And it confesses a terrible truth, that you don't know what happens when you die. You instead say, I'm not in my grave, I'm not there, I'm not in the shell, I'm in this everything else. Which of course is a whole other philosophy of life and death and the creation and all of that. But besides that, it's just weird and strange. I don't want your spirit in the snow. I pick that up and throw a snowball at my kid's face. I don't want a spirit in that. That's weird. You're not reincarnated into birds and it's chirping and it's singing. That's a whole thing too. And now you're in the rain, and are you being absorbed into the grass? And if I cut the grass, am I hurting you? And everything about it is weird. If you give it even 10 seconds of thought, it's just weird and strange and idiotic. However, on the right, on this side, it's actually right here above me, right there. It's yellow, it's small print, I know, and the people at the workshop complain too, but I'll read it to you and you'll hear it and it'll be fine. Let no one fear death, for the death of our Savior has set us free. He has destroyed it by enduring it. He destroyed death when he descended into it. He put into an uproar, even as it tasted of his flesh. Isaiah foretold this when he said, "You, O hell, have been troubled by encountering him below." Hell was in an uproar because it was done away with. It was in an uproar because it is mocked. It was in an uproar for it was destroyed. It is an uproar for it is annihilated. It is in an uproar for it is now made captive. Hell took a body and discovered God. It took earth and encountered heaven. It took what it saw and was overcome by what it did not see. O death, where is thy sting? O hell, where is thy victory? Christ is risen, and you, O death, are annihilated. Christ is risen, and the evil ones are cast down. Christ is risen, and the angels rejoice. Christ is risen, and life is liberated. Christ is risen, and the tomb is emptied of its dead. For Christ, having risen from the dead, is become the firstfruits of those who have fallen asleep. To him be glory and power forever and ever. Amen. So there's a difference, right? Clearly, there is a difference between the two. One is theological garbage, and one is Easter proclamation cranked to 11. And in fact, the yellow part is from an Easter sermon. And so I asked, what was the difference here? One is theologically sound and one is theological garbage. One proclaims Christ and him crucified and risen and the result of the resurrection, and one is telling a story of nothingness and pantheism, and it's just, spiritualized. It's just spiritualized. That's all it is. It's a spiritualized death. And so, there's lots of differences going on here. So one is a public domain poem used by funeral homes all the time. The yellow one is from John Chrysostom, a 4th century preacher, 3rd century preacher. Chrysostom means the golden-mouthed. He is generally regarded as the best preacher of the ancient world. His sermons have been recorded for over 1,700 years. I've got copies of John Chrysostom's sermons in my office. They are regarded as the best, and that he was the best preacher of the ancient world. And this Easter hymn sort of sounds like that. And so that's what's going on here. What we have here is Elizabeth Jansen funeral. It's a fictional person from this book. And I recognize, at the workshop, evidently in the last week or so, there was an Elizabeth Jansen with a T in the last name that died, Betty Jansen. And so I did not do that intentionally. And if you are a relative, I don't mean to do that either, but this is the name that the person made up. And this book is from like 2000. So it has nothing to do with her. So please don't hold it against me or the author for the following. But here's an example funeral that the author wants us to sort of hear. When Elizabeth Jansen died in Minneapolis nursing home in October, the staff immediately notified the closest relative, her daughter Sarah, in St. Louis. Sarah, who had faithfully visited her mother once a month, arranged for Elizabeth to be cremated, for the ashes to be sent to St. Louis, and for an obituary to be placed in the Minneapolis newspaper. In early November, Sarah took the ashes to a lake in rural Minnesota, where Elizabeth and her family had often vacationed, and scattered them on the water. A week later, a memorial service was held in the chapel of the Minneapolis church where Elizabeth had kept her membership, though her health had prevented her from attending for a number of years. On a table at the entrance to the chapel were placed several photographs of Elizabeth at various stages in her life, her Bible, a ceramic vase that she had made, and a few other personal mementos. At the service, Sarah read one of her mother's favorite poems. Elizabeth's younger sister told an amusing story about their childhood. the chaplain from the nursing home read Psalm 23 and prayed a brief prayer, giving thanks for Elizabeth's life, and two of Elizabeth's former students, she had once taught high school for more than 30 years, read fond reminiscences of her teacher. After a time of quiet reflection, during which was played a recording of Judy Collins' rendition of Amazing Grace, one of Elizabeth's favorite hymns, the small group in the chapel silently dispersed. Now, Elizabeth Jansen is fictitious, but the rituals marking her death represent the truth about a rapidly emerging trend in Christian funeral practices. With surprising swiftness and dramatic results, a significant segment of American Christians has, over the last 50 years, abandoned previously established funeral customs in favor of an entirely new pattern of memorializing the dead. This new pattern is not firmly fixed. Indeed, variations, improvisations, and personal customizations are marks of the new rituals, but it generally includes the following characteristics. A memorial service instead of a funeral, and so the service is focused on remembering the deceased, often held many days after the death with the body or the cremated remains of the deceased not present. A brief, simple, highly personalized and customized service, often involving several speakers, as opposed to the standard church funeral liturgy presided over primarily by clergy. A focus upon the life of the deceased, often aided by a physical display of photos and other mementos. An emphasis on joy rather than sadness, a celebration of life rather than an observance of the somber reality of death. And then a private disposition of the body, often done before the memorial service with an increasing preference for cremation. So, that's the little section here. And so things to know, and I mentioned there on this on the slide. So, does this sound familiar? And the answer is yes, I think it does. I think it mirrors many of the funeral services that I've participated in, that I've been asked to be a participant in funerals that I've attended. And so the question is this Christian? And when we go back to that first section about necessity, custom, and conviction, I'm not so sure. There are Christian undertones, right? So Psalm 23 was read, and a prayer was said, likely in the name of Jesus, because that was what the chaplain was asked to do in a church. But notice that the pastor of the congregation wasn't asked to speak. Instead, it was the chaplain from the nursing home. So that person doesn't have a congregation, and if they do, it's not the one that they're hosting it in. But they weren't the only speaker. And so outside of a prayer to maybe Jesus or just to God, and Psalm 23, which is an Old Testament writing, so it could be even a Jewish chaplain who reads Psalm 23 and prays to God. You have to kind of import Christianity into that service. It's not really present. I mean, it's in the church, but that service could have easily been held in the funeral home, right? I mean, they did it in the church just probably because it was a big enough space. Or at least they thought there were going to be more people who came, but they probably could have all fit in the funeral home because she was already in a nursing home, so she was probably already aged, so the funeral was probably small, and so on and so forth. People always think funerals are going to be more attended than they are. At least that's been sort of the dynamic. And so I'm not sure anything about that really was Christian. And that's kind of the point, is what does a Christian funeral look like? And at bare minimum, a Christian funeral tells a Christian story. And none of that was a Christian story. That was Elizabeth's story. It was Elizabeth-centered activity. But I'm not sure it was a funeral, and I'm pretty sure it wasn't Christian. And yet, how many Christians opt for that kind of service? How many of you were planning to have that kind of service? Is kind of the question. So the Christian funeral, we're thinking about the Christian funeral now. We've sort of seen the culture's funeral and its disembodiedness and sort of how that looks then. The Christian funeral has consisted of 3 basic parts over a period of time, and that is preparation, processional, and burial. So those 3 parts. But each of those 3 parts has changed from the beginning of the church, okay? And those changes there are pros and cons. And not all of them are theologically bad. They're just changes. And I'll show you what I mean by that. When we think about preparation, and by preparation I don't mean making the phone calls and getting the death certificate signed and figuring out who's going to be the executor of the will and who's going to get the death certificates and who's filing for the life insurance. Not that kind of preparation. I mean getting the body ready. Doing something with the person who's dead. That kind of preparation. And that has largely shifted to hospitals and funeral directors, and mostly funeral directors. So most people now are dying in either hospitals or nursing homes with medical staff present. And so then the medical staff will declare the person dead, and then the funeral home of choice will be called, and then then the body will be taken away from. Usually what happens is, let's say the person dies in the hospital. The family's given 20-30 minutes to have time with their recently deceased, and that's really just to give time to get the phone calls made to the undertaker or the funeral director, and to get the people who need to come up from the morgue to come up to the room and get all the stuff together and make sure there's a spot. So all those sort of things come up. The body is taken away from the family, and then the body doesn't get seen again until the visitation by the family. And so that could be days in which you go from the death of the person to seeing the person again embalmed and ready to go, in a sense. And so that preparation has disappeared from the hands of Christians because we've, in a sense, delegated it and hired it out. We have become wealthy enough to everyone gets to hire an undertaker for this thing. There was a time, and the author of the book talked about how in the ancient world, the poor didn't have that privilege, and there wasn't life insurance, and nobody was going to pay for someone else to get buried and put in a tomb. And so there were common graves, but then even then someone's got to take the body to the common grave. And the Jews didn't want to do that because it'd make them unclean. The Romans and the Greeks didn't want to do that because they don't want to deal with the poor. And so who's going to deal with these dead bodies? And lo and behold, the Christians did it. And it sort of made the Christians weird because they didn't have a problem handling the dead. They didn't have a problem carrying them and taking care of them and putting them in their own grave and marking them. And there was sort of this weirdness about Christians and how they were willing to have a sacredness to the dead and cared for them as sacred things. So that was the theology of Christ's incarnation coming into play into practical realities in the ancient world and sort of setting these Christians apart, that the church would bury people, the church would take care of it. And don't think, St. Peter's Cathedral, it's, a house church of 20 people. You could call them and they'd take care of it. And they became sort of these undertakers who prepare bodies for burial. And so that's part of that. And I'm not suggesting that we get back into that habit. If for some reason the whole concept of funeral directors falls away, or if the church is so persecuted you can't get a Christian funeral if you go through a funeral director, then okay, then we have to go back to preparing bodies. But until that happens, we're fine. I'm fine having the undertakers, the funeral directors, sort of deal with that. I'm not asking to go backwards on that one. The processional has also become a static moment. And by that I mean there was a movement from point A to point B, and with physical moving from place to place, and we've sort of now be just static. We just sit there. There isn't a movement. There's showing up to a place, sitting in a pew, and watching, and then leaving. You don't travel with the body in the same way. Some of that is still kept in Christian funerals. There is still a processing in with the body and a processing out with it. Some of that is maintained in certain settings, in some situations, and depending on the funeral director and your pastor and how things sort of get run, that's just sort of how that's going on. Burial has also been removed from the funeral. So it's not always a guarantee that the burial is going to happen with the funeral or shortly thereafter. And so the two services have been separated from each other. And sometimes there's days in between a funeral and a burial, either beforehand or after, or it's not happening at all. And it's just, so there's a separation there. So when we look at Christian funerals in the past, what did we sort of experience? Well, as I mentioned, the body was prepared by family and friends. That was pretty common. And then the body, this is where we sort of see this movement come. The body was carried in a casket from the home. Again, we're talking about sort of in a village, a small town, the rural life or city life. The body was carried from the home to the church. And at the church, a funeral was performed with the whole congregation. And from the church, the body was then carried to the nearby cemetery. And once at the cemetery, the grave was blessed and the body committed to God's grace. And so so you have to imagine this movement in which the body starts in the home, and the pallbearers, the casket carriers, are those who actually carry it from the home, and they're moving towards the cemetery. And as they're moving towards the cemetery, the pastor in his robe would meet them outside, and then he would usher them in. And so they would process down the aisle, and the pastor would lead them with a crucifer in front. So you'd have the cross, and you have the pastor, and then you have the casket, and then you have the family behind, and they're all being sort of carried up into the front, and then they're placed. And the pastor does his service, and the congregation is there, and they welcome the family, and they have the whole service, and then the whole congregation rises. The pastor and the crucifer leave out the church, and they lead the body, and they go back out the way they came, and they're all traveling together out to the cemetery. So sometimes the church has a cemetery on its premises, and you'd walk literally from the sanctuary to the cemetery, which was 100 yards away, or you'd walk a quarter of a mile over to the cemetery across the street or down the road or whatever. And there the gravesite was already prepared. And so then the whole congregation gathers together. There's a funeral, there's the committal service from the pastor, and he speaks, and the body is buried. And as you're traveling, there's singing, there's praying, there's consoling, there's all these sort of things going on by the brothers and sisters in Christ, and the congregation are supporting the family and helping to carry, and it's all this sort of movement, right? It's that last mile concept that we as the church travel that last mile from home to church to cemetery. We're all carrying it as we go. So that's sort of the idea of, that's sort of how we see that movement in the Christian past. And we've sort of, as in the Christian present, we've broken that movement up. Cemeteries are now not next to the church building, but they're miles away or a half mile away. We're somewhat close with the Concordia Cemetery here in Hammond. It's not that far away from Trinity Hammond, and it's a very short distance to travel. But I've been traveling. I've taken bodies from the church all the way to Maryville and to Cherryville, and there's bodies that have to travel into parts of Illinois, and the cemeteries. The family cemeteries cemeteries. Bodies go to the cemeteries of their families and not of their churches. And so sometimes those bodies get moved further out because the church, they originally went to church here, 100 years ago, and that's where Grandma and Grandpa were. But we moved as grandkids over to Hammond, and so we had the church service at Hammond, but we're going to go back to being buried with the family out in Maryville. There's a separation there. And so because there's a separation, there then becomes this divide between the funeral and the committal service. There's already a divide then between the preparation and the funeral service. And so there's just these big breaks, not only in time but in place going on. So the movement of the body told a fundamental story. Taken as a whole, the early Christian funeral was based on the conviction that the deceased was a saint, a child of God, and a brother and sister in Christ, worthy to be honored and embraced with tender affection. The funeral journey itself was deemed to be the last phase of a lifelong journey toward God, and the faithful carried the deceased along the way to the place of final departure with singing and a mixture of grief and joyful hope. That's sort of the, sorry, I was in the way. I'll preface that for a second. And so that's how we saw the Christian funeral, as this movement that told a story, that expressed our conviction as to what was going on. And so what happened? Well, a short history lesson here. Since literalistic views of heaven and the saintly journey are no longer plausible to us, and where does that come from? It comes from the Enlightenment philosophy, mixed with the horrors of the Civil War, has reshaped American theology and religion to sort of put aside heaven and hell and souls and angels and spirits, and we're sort of becoming more materialistic in some ways and spiritualistic in others, but not as Christian. And so we lack the theological imagination to grasp the poetic truth and power of these metaphors. Of dead Christians have nowhere to go but to evaporate into the spiritual ether and into our frail memory banks. With heaven domesticated, the soul morphed into an immortal gas, the corpse became a shell, and the cemetery moved out of sight. It was almost inevitable that the dead with their embarrassing bodies would be banned from their own funerals, and the living would be condemned to sit motionless, contemplating the meaning of it all, and pretend to celebrate life. And so this is sort of where we stand now. This is the problem that we face, is that as a culture, as a people, we've abandoned the theology of heaven and hell, the theology of resurrection, and we've moved into the sort of immortal soul that's this gas, invisible thing, and the corpse is a shell, and we've moved death and dying out of sight. And so the dead don't seem to have a place in our life anymore, and certainly not their bodies. And so when we gather together, we don't have anything to say, we don't have anything to do, we don't have anything to act out. And so we sit motionless, and we contemplate the meaning, and we pretend to celebrate when nothing in us feels like celebrating. So what do we want? This is a question worth asking, right? So we as Christians, what do we want to see happen? In a funeral, what is true about worship, namely that the gospel story is proclaimed, comes to a particular focus around the occasion of a death. The major theme of the funeral is the gospel story, and the life story of the person who has died is a motif running throughout this larger theme. More precisely, a funeral is about the intertwining of these two narratives. What does that mean? It means the funeral is still fundamentally a worship service of the congregation, of the church. And because it is fundamentally a worship service, it is fundamentally about Jesus Christ. Now, all worship services have motifs running through them. They have points of emphasis, these facets of this great jewel of the gospel. And you see that happening through like the church year. So for example, Easter Sunday has, this theme of victory and celebration and life and resurrection. And Ash Wednesday has a completely different theme, a completely different point of emphasis, a completely different motif. And so that one's on our mortality and sin and death and what Jesus comes to do because of it. And then there's a common time where we're just learning about the teaching of Jesus, and we tie in the hymns and we tie in the texts, and it's about being a missional people, or being content with the gifts of God, or learning to work in our vocations and being blessings in our vocations, and being the body of Christ. All of these things are different motifs that run through worship services, different themes, different points of emphasis. And so on a funeral day, on a funeral worship service, the motif, the point of emphasis, is the Christian faith of the man or woman who died. It's their life, their personalized motif in the story of Jesus Christ and his death and resurrection. And so instead of focusing on vocation, or focusing on being missional, or focusing on baptizing, or focusing on understanding the theology of the Lord's Supper, it's understanding Christ's blessings to Jim, to Susie, to whomever, and how Christ is intertwined in their life. That's what we're wanting to do. We're wanting to intertwine these stories, these two narratives. One's a human life narrative, and one is the narrative of the gospel. And we're tying them together. And there's ramifications that come out of this desire, right? So when it's clear that the funeral is a dramatic reenactment of the gospel, this shines a bright light on what a funeral is not. Despite popular misconceptions, a funeral is not primarily a quiet time when people gather to reflect on the legacy of the deceased. A funeral is not a devotional service dealing with grief. A funeral is not a show of community support for the mourning family. And a funeral is not even a celebration of life. Good funerals do all these things. But these are some of the consequences of a good funeral and not its central meaning or purpose. Now, do you understand that distinction? Because it's an important distinction. When a funeral worship service is done well and the center is Christ's death and resurrection and the gospel story intertwined with the person, that theology deals with grief. That theology celebrates the victory over death that the person has. That theology allows us to mourn with the family. It allows us to put our arms around them and encourage them and give them peace and comfort in this moment of emotional turmoil. It does that through the theology, through the words spoken, through the songs sung. All of these things happen in a good funeral. A funeral focused on Christ. A funeral focused on the death and resurrection promised to the individual through Christ, through their baptism that they have sustained through the eating and drinking of the Lord's Supper. That has culminated in this moment of death when we remember the promises given to them. That's what a good funeral does. But if you shift the emphasis from Christ's death and resurrection to a devotional about God's presence in the life of His people, we hear Psalm 23, Jesus is the good shepherd who guides us and leads us along life journey, and who is with us even in this time of death and sadness and grief. And I want to comfort the family with the knowledge that Jesus still holds Jim in His arms, and he is loved, and you are loved, and everybody's loved. And I hope everybody's comforted with these feelings of love that I'm just telling you about and don't have any real substance to. If you just want to comfort people with words, with a devotion, okay, you can do that. Or if the focus is on greeting and shaking hands with the mourning, then the visitation does that, right? When we have to walk and stand in line for an hour and we put the family up there by a casket and we make them have to hug people and shake hands, and that's what we're doing there. But it's not comforting. Nobody likes standing up there shaking hands. They're all miserable. And having people come up and shake their hands, and I'm sorry for your loss, and Jimmy was a good guy, and I knew him from here, and I remember you. I remember meeting you that one time at this one place, and yeah, it was great. And we move on. We can, it's a video. I'm in my studio. I can speak honestly here. Everybody knows that this is garbage. Everybody knows it's not fun. Everybody knows you don't really want to do it, but because it's the custom, and because we feel like, oh, this is the only time that we can express our encouragement and comfort and peace to them, it's dealing with a custom. You don't have to do it. You don't have to do it. You don't have to make your family stand in a line and greet people. If after the service, if you come to the funeral and maybe they're going to be comforted by you showing up. Instead of having 150 people come through the line on Friday, maybe have 150 people in the pews singing songs and praying with them in the pews in this act of worship. Maybe that's more encouraging and a lot more pleasant. Just speaking some honest words here. At least from my opinion. They are only my opinion, and you can do what you want, and you can have your visitation for 3 hours at the funeral home, and you can have your granddaughter shake hands and your kids shake hands with people they've never really met and don't really know. And so that you can see the body, and it gets people out of going to church. That's what it does. That's all it does. That's what the visitation hours do. It gets people from having to go to church. It gets them off the hook. because they're supposed to be in church singing songs. And we'll get to that. We'll get to that. I don't want to get started on a tangent. You don't want to get me riled up too quickly. So first, a good funeral. There are three things a good funeral has, three marks of a good funeral. The first is a good funeral has its foundation in baptism. Romans 6 should play a role in your baptismal liturgy or your funeral liturgy, and it does in the Lutheran Church. Baptism takes center stage right at the beginning. You have the invocation, which in itself is a remembrance of baptism, and then the next thing you do is a remembrance of baptism. In baptism, this person, was clothed in the robes of righteousness, and then the congregation confesses that that is what has happened to this person. A remembrance of baptism. And then you jump into some of the readings in the liturgy. But the first thing you do is remember the baptism, because baptism is the foundation of resurrection and death. So, to proclaim the gospel story must begin where faith begins. You're going to tell the gospel story, you got to start where this gospel story starts, and that's at baptism. When Christians traveling along the baptismal path die, the company of the faithful who were there to guide them at the beginning are also there to carry them at the end. And what that quote means is, when we baptize the believer, which we did on Sunday, so we baptized little Oliver, and at the end of the baptismal service, there's a welcome of the congregation. The congregation prays, and then we welcome Oliver into our sheepfold, into our community of believers. And this community of believers has taken on the task to guide that Christian all the way from where they're at now, all the way to their death. That's the promise the congregation takes. And so the congregation comes together at the end of that person's life in the same way that they came together at that baptismal life, the entrance into the baptismal life. And so if the church is coming together then, it's encouraging them through the entire life. It's there also at the end. And so baptism serves that purpose as well. In fact, the congregation at a funeral is not an audience. They are the actors. They are themselves on stage, moving and gesturing at the right time, singing, speaking, and praying their lines in the great drama of death and life. That is absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. If you've ever been to a funeral in a funeral home where not a single church member shows up, you will know exactly what I'm talking about. Those funerals stink. They stink. They're terrible funerals because there's nobody there that knows what they're supposed to do. Because all the people there aren't members of the church. They don't know what the pastor wants them to do. They don't know the liturgy. They don't know the lines. They don't know that the little C in bold and the bold line is their line to say. They don't know it. They go to some Catholic church. They go to some Protestant church. They go to some non-denominational with the things on the screen and they don't say anything and they just sit there and they worship and the songs get played, or they haven't been to church in decades. They need the church there to assist, to perform, to do their part. The congregation needs to show up for funerals. And it's a preaching point worth saying every once in a while, and I haven't done it in my sermons because there's enough law emphasis to go around, but the church needs to show up. And they need to be heavily present. Not just, they need to show up. They need to do their part. They assist the pastor, the congregation, the family. It's their part to contribute to the funeral. To speak the lines, to sing the songs the family's not going to sing. They're in tears in the front two rows. They can't muster a prayer or a song. They have to rely on the people behind them to sing. They have to hear our voices, the church's voices, singing the songs, confessing the truths that they can't confess right now in their pain and grief. That's why funerals without the church present don't have any songs. That's why nobody sings. Because you don't know the songs. You don't feel like singing because you're the family. You're the ones who are grief-stricken. Only when it's at the church do people want to sing because the family members don't want to sing. The church sings. The church sings for the family. It's their voice to God, thanking them for the life, thanking them for the truth, the resurrection, Jesus Christ. All of that's being spoken by the congregation. Again, getting riled up. I care about these things. So you're not just an audience. You're not just sitting there like a bump on a log. You are participating. It's your job to be the model Christian, to speak the truth that needs to be spoken. Second, a good funeral remains true to the Christian narrative and not some other story. A funeral is not a quiet or even passive gathering of people who've come together to hear some soothing and inspiring words of comfort. It's not what it's for. It's to tell a story, tell the Christian story to all those who are there, to remind them of the truth of the gospel, even when death is staring them in the face. It is not a secularized seance calling upon the spirit of the dead to be present in our memories or hearts. It's not that. So much of our cultural funerals are secularized seances. We're calling upon the memory of Jim. We're calling upon the spirits. We want to keep Jim into our hearts. We want to keep him in our memories. We know that he's here. We know that he's there. That's why we have lots of speakers come and talk about his life, talk about the memories we have. Talk about Jim at work, and talk about Jim as a family man. Talk about him as a good father, good husband, good worker. We have to call him into memory so we remember these stories, so that he stays with us in our hearts and in our minds. It's a seance. We're asking the spirit of the person to come be in our presence. We become witches and wizards, not Christians. We don't have control over spirits. And furthermore, and this next quote's important, the gospel does not place the burden on the living to keep alive the spiritual flame of memory. Rather, it affirms that the deceased is now raised to new life and sings in the great choir of the communion of the saints. Do you see the difference? It's not our job as the living to hold on to the memory of the deceased to keep them alive. I remember, this is a childhood memory from a bad TV movie, made-for-TV movie. There was, I think it was Merlin. I think it was like in the 90s. There was some show called Merlin. It was like a 3 or 4 day special, and it was like 4 parts, and there was Merlin and King Arthur and magic, and it was a whole thing. And there was, I remember the scene at the end, because the villain was also a goddess or a witch of some sort, or I think she was a goddess of something. But she was she was the villain, and the only way that she has life is if people recognize her and remember her and worship her in some way. And if people stop worshiping and stop believing in her, she just disappears, because it's on the living, it's on her devotees to keep her memory and keep her alive. And so this is what has happened to all the Greek gods and goddesses in mythology. Is they become myths, they've been forgotten, they don't have anyone devoted to them. And so when there's no longer anyone devoted to them, their memory dies and they disappear from all presence, and they no longer have power in the world. And that's sort of how we treat the dead, which is weird, because then the onus, the burden is upon you to keep the dead alive in your hearts, otherwise they just disappear. And so if we don't keep the picture shrine, if we don't keep the mementos, if we don't keep the room exactly how it was, and we don't keep those memories, then that person's just gone forever. And it's a burden upon us to make sure that we always have these memories. We always have them in our heart. We always have this shrine built to them so that we remember. Because if we forget even for a moment, they're gone forever. That's a heavy burden to bear. A heavy burden. And, this author, and this is why the end of the quote's a little bit, we're like, why does he say that? He's a proponent of option 3, from part 1, option 3 at the very end where the dead go. He's a transport kind of guy, that the spirit has already been transported. The spirit has already been gathered together with the resurrected body, and it's fine. It's alive. It's enjoying the new heavens and new earth. It's outside of time. It's over there. It's enjoying paradise now. So there's no reason to try and keep it alive in your memories. It's already living a life. That person is living a life greater than we can imagine already. Right? That's what his point is. And you could go to option 2 and sort of have that soul sleep, and that's fine too. They're at rest, and the burden's still not on you to keep them alive, because the promise is God's promise, not your promise. And so if you trust in God and believe his promises, then you do not have the obligation to keep the memory alive. That's not how you keep the person alive. God keeps the person alive. God is not a God of the dead, but of the living. And so if that's true, and if you believe that, then you don't have to keep the memories, the tokens. You don't have to be responsible for keeping that memory alive in your life. You can recognize that they're at rest or that they're in paradise. They're already enjoying the new heavens and the new earth. You're the one to be pitied. So there's that. We're not spiritual seances. We're not witches and wizards. We're not trying to keep memories alive so that people stay alive. We believe in the resurrection of the dead. And that's the story we tell. And finally, a good funeral acts as a sacred ritual to reaffirm and deepen the gospel vision of life and death. And recognizing that the funeral is a ritual is important because rituals play a role in our lives. Why do we have birthday celebrations? Why do we have anniversary celebrations? Why do we have Thanksgiving and Christmas and Easter every year? Why do we have these rituals? Well, they shape our ordinary time. And that's, they're... And that's the second point here. The frame ordinary time is extraordinary time, extraordinary character of everyday life. What it means is that when we have these frameworks, these moments, they frame our time, because as we get older, we're not in grade school anymore, and we've sort of got our job, and our job is the same thing every day, and we got a routine, and we're just sort of going through things. These extraordinary times sort of mark out the moments. They give us time to reflect. They give us a time to think about the time that has passed and the time that's going forward, and the last time we gathered together. How many times have I overheard this line? I haven't seen you since Uncle Jim's funeral 3 years ago. Well, now they've framed their time frame, right? Their time is now categorized by 2 different funerals, one for Uncle Jim and one for Aunt Susie. And we haven't seen each other since. What's been going on in this time frame? And then we categorize our ordinary time in this chunk. Betsy's gotten big and Joseph's gotten tall and now he's playing basketball, and we sort of sense these moments, and that's what these rituals do. And so that's part of their role. And the first point on this slide is funerals are ordered events that are performed in times of upheaval and disorder. And so, and as a community, we see rituals in that second way. As individuals, we see them sort of more in this first point. And the better way to see this, the easier way to see this as an explanation is weddings. And weddings are a ritual, right? We have a ritual wedding, and there are things that happen in a wedding that we just sort of expect, right? You're going down the aisle, and you're walking down with your father, and you're handed off to the groom, and some words are said, and some prayers are spoken, and rings are exchanged, and then there's a kiss. And then you have a reception, you have a party. Right? That's a wedding. And so that's the ritual. And yes, there's different things added in, and different cultures add different things in, but it accomplishes a couple different things. We recognize that a wedding is a chaotic time. It's a time of upheaval, a time of disorder, a time when new roles are getting sorted out. Why does the father walk the bride down the aisle? Because the father is now ushering in and allowing for this chaos, this upheaval, this removal of one situation into another. His house is now going to be forever changed. In the same way that a birth forever changes a household, because I'll tell you, there's a difference between making a meal for 2 and making a meal for 3 and making a meal for 5. That was my life, and our life was thrown into upheaval every time we brought in a child into our home. New patterns had to exist, new schedules, new routines, new disciplinary measures. Everything was new in a time of upheaval, and it was chaotic. And you have to come up with rituals to sort of, deal with this upheaval. And it's the same thing when things move and things disappear and things change. And so when a daughter or a son is leaving the house and taking on a spouse and moving to a new place and a new job and a new situation and a new finances, all of that's new and all of that's chaotic and upheaval, and it takes time to sort that out. And the community has to recognize this new reality. Not just the family, but the community has to recognize that this this little Susie now belongs to Jim, and it's not Jeff's daughter, it's Jim's wife. That's how, in a sense, it's a little patriarchal focused in that metaphor, but that is sort of what the ceremony is doing. It's handing off responsibility from one patriarch to a new one, from a father to a husband. And yes, in a sense, Jim's status changes from single to married. He's now the husband of Susie. I'm trying to reuse the same names so I don't lose track of the made-up names that I'm using. So Jim and Susie are playing a major role in these videos. I don't. If you're Jim or Sue, don't take it personally. And so, the marriage ritual helps in that transition, that movement from one stage to another. In the same way, the funeral is a ritual. It does the same sort of thing. There's upheaval and disorder that comes with the death. If it's the death of a husband, the wife has a new routine. She has a new way of life. She has a new way of making meals. She has a new home life, a new schedule. Everything sort of changes. There's this upheaval. If it's the life of the last remaining parent, then all of a sudden the kids have this new responsibility, new vocations, new roles. There's now someone else in charge, someone else to turn to. You're now the patriarch or the matriarch of this family. You're now the one who's got all the grandkids and the cousins under your purview. You may be the oldest sister or the oldest brother, or you're the responsible one or whatever. You're the one left in charge. And there's a lot of upheaval with that. There's a lot of change. If you were the one caring for them and that person dies, your whole life changes. And so when life gets into this full sort of transition mode of upheaval and disarray and you don't know what's going on anymore, the funeral acts as this moment of transition, this recognition that yes, everything changes now. Everything's different now. Life is not the same after this moment. Not for us, not for those of us, in those first few pews that are going to miss Uncle Jim from here on out. So there's that, and that's part of what a good funeral does. Is it does that ritual purpose for us as people. Now, what are some tools? And this I've talked a little bit about this a little bit. And I've alluded to some of these other ones, and the participants one I've already went off on a tangent. But this one is also going to get me off on another tangent, so just be prepared. Place. You want a good funeral? You want your funeral to be good and to be faithful? Then you better have it at church. There. I'm serious. Have it at church. Do not have your Christian funeral at a funeral home. Don't have it out in a field. Don't have it out at the lake. Have it at church. You heathen. Church is where a funeral belongs, because that's where the church worships. And the funeral is a worship service focused on Christ. That's the story you want to tell. That's the confession you want to make. That's the conviction you want to show, is that you are being carried by your brothers and sisters that last mile of the journey to God in the place where He has promised to be. And that's the church. Second point on that same place, with less anger tones maybe. It's your church. Put it at your church. I don't care if you moved over 10 miles away and you haven't gone to church. Put it at your church. Because a story is told in your church of your life. You want to make the pastor's job a little easier? Have it in your church. You know why? Because I can point to your pew. I can point to the hymnal that you use, the seat that you sit in. I can point to the spot over in the fellowship hall where that person sat in for Bible study. Your story is intertwined with that building. It's not intertwined at the funeral home down the street. You walked in there once to buy your casket ahead of time and to make sure you had the funeral director on board with whatever sort of customizations you wanted on whatever. You don't have any affiliation with that place. You just paid them a check and walked out. Your life was lived in the church. That's where your story began as a Christian and where it ends as a Christian. It's in the church with your pastor who knows you, who can speak well of you, who can speak about your faith in that place, the questions that you would ask, the things you would think about, the times you came into his office and spoke to him. Those are the things that matter and can be used to tell your story, because you want to tell a story. The story at a funeral home, the story at a graveside, the story at some place far away is a sanitized story. It's a common story. It's a cultural story. There's no story that can be told in a funeral home. You're not there. And not like you're a shell of yourself, not that. There's no connection to you. There's no, I mean, you have to import it, right? You have to bring in photos and pictures and elements of your life into the funeral home to make it sort of feel like you belong there. You don't have to do that in a church. Not your church. And yeah, if you can't do it in your church, you can have it in another church. At least then you're at a place where there's a baptismal font to point to, a place where there's an altar rail, a place where there's a pulpit, a place where you could have foreseeably kneeled and joined the communion of the saints. There's at least that. Generic places are for generic funerals, and you're having a Christian funeral. Just FYI. At least if I'm going to do it. Participants, the funeral is about meaning, and that meaning is acted out by the faithful fulfilling their role as Christians. When we see the funeral as a time to receive or give comfort or as religious grief therapy, there's little reason to participate. And what that means is, if we as Christians don't understand the funeral as a worship service, but understand it as something else, some of those other side characteristics, then we don't have to be there. If we see the funeral as grief therapy for the family, and I don't need to, I'm not feeling grieved, I'm not mourning right now, I don't need to be there. Wrong. As Christians, we need to be there because we are participants in worship. When the church gathers together, Christians gather together. And so we have a job to do when it comes to funerals. Now, it's also important to recognize, I've talked about all the other stuff. You've already heard me go off on that tangent. And again, it also ties in with that visitation tangent. If the point of a funeral is to encourage people in their grief, then we show up for the visitation, we shake hands, we're in and out 15 minutes, and we're out. Right? We don't have to do singing, we don't have to do reading, we don't have to sit, we don't have to listen. We just go in, shake their hands, sorry for your loss, oh, you look so great, it's a really nice casket, out you go. That's not what a Christian does at a funeral. It's what you can do at a visitation, I guess, because it's not a funeral. Words and actions, right? The tools of a good funeral comes down to what you're saying. And this is mostly my job as pastor, but also the actions that happen, the liturgical elements that you choose. If you choose to have a Lutheran funeral, you're going to have a Lutheran liturgy, and the Lutheran liturgy is going to tell a story. And using those words and using those actions, the standing and the rising and the praying and the kneeling, all these sort of things occur to tell a story and to tell. It's using the movement of worship as a tool to convey messages in the same way that stained glass conveys a message and the pictures convey a message. All those sort of things sort of serve those purposes. And finally, theology. The funeral is rooted in an understanding of the world and life. We root our funerals in a real theology, and not a generic cultural theology, but a Christian theology, a Lutheran theology, a theology that proclaims the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. And a right theology will flow from the Word and the Holy Spirit, and that's what that final line says. And theology is the rule that measures everything, right? So we judge everything by our theology. If something is theologically lacking, it's going to lack in meaning and it's going to lack in purpose. And so that right theology is going to flow out of the Word. And we see that in our Lutheran liturgy and our divine service and our matins and all those sort of different services that are in that front part of the hymnal. If you've ever flipped through that, you're going to find scripture citations on the right-hand side in little italics. It's going to tell you right where we get these words from. Sometimes they're direct quotations from 1 John and from Luke and from Psalm this and Psalm that, and it's a scriptural word-based service, and that's what our theology is that the Holy Spirit works through the Word upon those who hear it. All right, and so we've reached the end of the video. I don't think I was necessarily shorter than the last one, but that's the way it goes. Sort of quick review, what makes a good funeral, or why do we have funerals? I've disappeared off the stage. Here I am. A good funeral, our funeral comes about because of necessity, culture, and conviction. And those three things are all shaped by our Christian faith. It has a movement that tells a story. And that story is the one of Christ with your life story intertwined within. And then it has some fundamental elements. It has baptism as its focus. It has sacred ritual, and it has the gospel story all sort of tied together as its function. And so that's a quick review of part 2. Part 3, we're going to get into some of the nitty-gritty, the details, the liturgy and what that looks like, and what a funeral is all about. And I'll show you some of the pre-planning sheets and things that you as a Christian can help tell your pastor about what you want and what story you want to tell. So that's the theme for part 3, and I'll see you there.